Yeah, I'll give a quick comment about that. Big Bang Theory and evolution in how Christians have accepted or understood it. The Big Bang Theory just states, and there's a couple of variations of the Big Bang Theory, but the main thing is that the universe began to exist. The universe is not eternal. Up until the Big Bang Theory, most secular scientists just assumed the universe is eternal. It's always been here. And the Big Bang Theory said, no, actually, we can show that the universe had a beginning. And it began at what's called a singularity, and it expanded from there, etc., over billions of years. Well, a lot of Christians were up in arms about this because it wasn't a literal reading of Genesis 1. But a number of other Christians, in fact, the majority of Christians said, wait a minute, all you're saying is that the Big Bang Theory says that the universe had a beginning? Well, so does the Bible. And if you read Genesis 1:1 and try to imagine it, it probably made a pretty big bang. When God said, let there be everything. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And a number of Christians have said that's a pretty good theological statement of what might have happened. So a number of Christians have said, we don't really see any problem with the Big Bang. And a number of non-believing scientists have actually come to belief in a creator God, though not necessarily the God of the Bible, but a creator God based on the findings of Big Bang cosmology. Anthony Flew was a famous atheist who spent the last 60 years of his life debating Christians over the existence of God. I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, finally admitted, I now believe there's a God based on the evidence from, Big Bang cosmology and creation, intelligent design, all that stuff. So a number of Christians have said there's no problem between Big Bang. Evolution is a different issue, although they sometimes get tied together by people who want to attack both of them. Christians have accepted evolution to varying degrees throughout church history. Some Christians, two of the authors of the Fundamentals, the volume of works that came out in the early 1900s that gave rise to what we know as fundamentalism, two of the authors were believers in evolution. James Orr was one of them, very famous fundamentalist, believed in evolution. So the myth that all people that believe in evolution are liberal and heretics, and if you really take the Bible seriously, you completely dismiss evolution, that's not true historically. But a number of Christians have had problems with different ways that the theory of evolution has been put forward. And classic Darwinian evolution says that what drives evolution is not any divine plan, or God interacting in any way, but it's these chance mutations that happen within certain life, or in all life forms, that in their genomes, and those create small variations, and then over time those variations get passed on, etc. So it ultimately comes down to nature selecting based on random chance occurrences of beneficial traits in animals. Now, some Christians like Ken Miller and others have said, and Francis Collins, who's the director of the Human Genome Project and an evangelical Christian, he said, we don't see any problem with that. That's an amazingly beautiful way for God to direct life on earth. And so they read Genesis 1 as a theological description of God's purpose, but then they look to modern science as the actual description of how it happened. Other Christians have said, I don't think they're as separate as you see they are. I think Genesis 1 is not just speaking theology, but it's also giving a generally reliable history, albeit from a theological point of view, of God's creation. And all you have to do is factor in things like phenomenological language, where it's describing things not in scientific detail, but just in general, and factor in that the days don't have to be a literal 24-hour days. It could be a period of millions of years. And so that arrives, you get what's called a day-age view, where the days of Genesis correspond to ages of the Earth's development. And then other Christians have said, no, it's whatever we're learning from science must be wrong, because a day means a day, and it happened in 24 hours, and it's about 10,000 years ago, and we just need to accept that if we really trust the Bible. And so those are three positions at the bottom of your page, three main evangelical views regarding Genesis 1. The first view is the literal or young earth creationist view. This is a view that's popular among the majority of conservative Christians and definitely fundamentalists. And that view says that all the events in Genesis took place as described, and the descriptions are literally accurate. And how it works out, there's all kinds of developments. The big proponent of this view, this really started to gain steam among Christian intellectuals when Henry Morris and I think John Whitcomb published the Genesis Flood back in the 60s. And I think they were hydraulic engineers or some scientists, working scientists, not biologists or evolutionary biologists or physicists or anything, but they produced and put forward the idea that all of the Earth's life form development, all of the Earth's geological development, all of it can be explained by Noah's flood. Grand Canyon, not created over millions of years, but created over a period of maybe a year or so by the flood. It gave rise to what today is known as the creation science movement, or young Earth creationism. And there's a museum in Kentucky, the Creation Museum, and you can go. Kent Hovind started it. He's in jail now for tax evasion, but he started the museum, and you can go there and you can see Adam and Eve riding dinosaurs and playing with lions and all this. You just get a whole tour of how young Earth creationism views the literal reading of Genesis. And good, faithful, godly Christians hold this view. I don't want to belittle, but it's not the only view. It's one view. The other view, the second view, is the day-age view, like I just mentioned. And the day-age view says that the ages roughly correspond to long periods of time, the days rather, and that Genesis 1 is pretty reliable if you take that into account and read it not as a technical description, but as a general description of how life developed. Big proponent of that is Hugh Ross and the ministry called Reasons to Believe, which is a ministry of scientists who are Christians, and it's devoted to bridging the gap between science and faith. And one of his best-known books, and it's a really, really, really good book that comes from this view, is called The Genesis Question: Scientific Advances and the Accuracy of Genesis. And Hugh Ross believed, he's an astrophysicist, he came to faith in college. He came to faith, he says, in the beginning by reading Genesis 1 and saying, wow, if you see this using ancient language, this actually describes what we know of as how Earth developed. And this is pretty accurate for an ancient people group. There's got to be something here. So that's one view. And another proponent of his, or proponent of the same view as his, David Snook, who's a professor at University of Pittsburgh, and he wrote A Biblical Case for an Old Earth. And in this, what he says is there's good textual biblical reasons to not read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 as scientifically accurate, chronological, literal accounts. There's good biblical reasons to read them as something else. So that's the second view. And then the third view heavily emphasizes this pattern. And it's called the framework view, or the literary view. And it says, this framework pattern, this literary pattern that's undeniable in Genesis 1, everybody recognizes it and has for a long time. This shows us that Genesis 1 is not trying to even talk about issues of chronology. It's not trying to give us the how. It's trying to give us the who and the why. And so it should not be read literally, any more so than poetry in later parts of the Bible should be read literally. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It's 100% true, but it's not literally true. And the analogy would be that, and this is an analogy that I grew up with this when Dad shared it with me as a kid, is how can something be look totally unlike what we see in science and still be true? One of them has to be wrong. Well, if I brought in an Encyclopedia Britannica and opened it up to the entry on person, you find this clear, plastic, multi-layered sheet where you can peel back. It's like a person standing like this, or a frog like this. You peel back the layer, and then the next section it shows all their organs. And then you can turn the page, and the next section it just shows their muscles, and then you turn that page and it shows their skeleton. So you're getting a multi-layered view, right, of this. So if I were to take one of that section on human and hold that up, and then a picture of the Mona Lisa, and hold that up and say which one of these shows a human, what would be the answer? Both. But I'd say, wait a minute, they don't look anything alike at all. This has layers and skeletal structure and muscles and tissue. This has some weird-looking man/woman with a crazy smile that nobody can figure out. What's going on here? These don't look anything alike. But yet you're telling me they're both true representations of a human? And the answer would be yes. Why? Why do they look different? What necessitates them looking different from one another? Yes, different purposes. One's telling you what's on the inside down to the nitty-gritty detail, and one's giving you an overall picture of one impression of a human. One's trying to capture beauty or make an artistic statement. One is trying to give you as much detail as possible. And to me, that's a great analogy for how to approach Genesis and science. Genesis is not trying to give you every detail possible. Genesis isn't trying to tell you what about the dinosaurs. It's not trying to tell you how old is the Earth, or how did the Grand Canyon form. It's not trying to tell that stuff. How did life develop on Earth? Were there evolutionary processes involved, or what? It doesn't say that. What it is trying to tell you is that humans were made in God's image, that they weren't an afterthought, they weren't a genetic accident or an evolutionary byproduct, as some Darwinists would say. It's telling you that. The rest of the details, God basically says, hey, look around you for those answers. In fact, we'll close on this and turn to Psalm 19. The first section, verses 1 through 6, are all about what you can learn from God through looking at His creation. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims His handiwork. Day after day they pour out speech. Night after night they communicate knowledge. Now the psalmist isn't literally saying that the sky and things literally talk. But he's using a metaphor to say nature speaks of God's glory. You can look to the creation and learn about God. Then, in the second part of the psalm, beginning in verse 7, the psalmist moves from God's natural revelation to God's special revelation and starts talking about the words of God, the instruction of God, the Torah. So the first part is talking about what we learn about God through His natural revelation, the world around us. The second part of the psalm talks about what we learn about God through His revealed word, His special revelation. And then the third part, in verse 12 and 13 and 14, is the psalmist and our response to both. And what this presents to me is a great illustration and a poetic illustration of what theologians have called the two-book metaphor. That there are two books that we read to learn about God. One is the book of nature, and one is the book of Scripture. And any view of God that it conflicts with either of those views means that we're not reading one of the books correctly, or we're not reading both of them correctly. And so the job of the Christian who's wanting to be faithful to God's revelation in Scripture and through the world around us is to seek to read both Scripture and nature, or science, accurately. And the mistakes come when somebody tries to read science as if it's theology, and you end up with stuff like the popular atheist Richard Dawkins, the God Delusion. He pontificates theologically all the time in his supposedly scientific writings. And it's bad theology. I mean, it's just basic, like most kindergartners could answer some of the objections that he has against God. And one of his fellow scientists and Oxford guys, Alistair McGrath, wrote a nice answer, The Dawkins Delusion. And it just goes through and categorizes and shows the errors that Dawkins makes in his theological claims. When Richard Dawkins speaks as a scientist, because he's a genetic biologist by trade, he knows his stuff. When he starts to speak as a theologian or a philosopher, he's woefully out of his area of expertise. But the same thing's true of Christians who try to speak as scientists, who have no training in the sciences, or if they do, it's in science branches that they're not talking in. So we have to be careful of trying to read theology scientifically and trying to read science theologically, and read both as they're meant to be read. The book back in the 50s, probably one of the most influential books in all of history regarding how Christianity and science interacts was a book by Bernard Ramm, R-A-M-M, and it's called A Christian View of Science and Scripture. And it's one of the key, it was a landmark in evangelical thought because it was Bernard Ramm, who was an evangelical theologian, addressing issues of scientific debate among Christians, like evolution and the development of everything from Neanderthals and biological life and Big Bang and all this stuff. It was the first well-known serious attempt to wrestle with these issues. The last book I'll mention before break is, for the three views that Christians hold, the best way, if you're trying to figure out, well, what do I believe about Genesis? Which view do I hold to? The best way to figure that out is to listen to people who hold the views, to talk with each other and critique each other. And the Genesis debate is edited by David Hagopan. This has all three views and proponents of each of those views, and they get to present their case. This is why I think this view best reflects Genesis. And then they get to be critiqued by the other two. And then they get to respond to those critiques. So it's like listening in on a discussion of this particular issue, Genesis, and how do we interpret Genesis 1 from all the sides of it. More than anything, we have to approach Scripture on its terms, not on our terms. And so nowhere is that better exemplified, until you get to Revelation, than in how Christians have approached Genesis 1. I intentionally haven't said where I stand on the issue, and I won't unless you ask me personally. But whatever view you hold, as long as it's grounded in Scripture and can be shown from Scripture, and you are convinced from your reading of Scripture, then that's acceptable. We aren't all going to agree, and Christians don't always agree. Christians rarely agree. But unity doesn't mean uniformity, and we can have differing opinions on differing views of a secondary nature. And the Genesis account and how that works is one of those views that Christians can disagree on. So don't ever let anybody tell you that you've got to have one view of Genesis or else you're not a real Christian. Because you can rest assured they're not a real scholar if they're saying that.